Okay, fantastic. So, I'm Liam Briley. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's event. I'm chair of the RSS Merseyside local group. In this room today, we're not planning to have any fire drills. So if the alarm does go off, that will be real. So we need to make our way outside that way. And our topic for today's event is Bayesian real-time modeling. And large-scale data platforms are a really important way of tackling pressing global issues now. Now, there's some kind of irony around this meeting because we intended to have this back in 2020 because of some very real-time global issues. We haven't been able to, so I'm very glad that Professor Darren Wilkinson and Professor Peter Neal could now be here in person today. We've got two excellent talks coming up on Bayesian methodology for real-time data, and each talk is going to be around 40 minutes, and we're going to have some questions and answers following. Before we start, I just wanted to mention that we've got our next event on the 7th of December, so that's going to be on the topic of statistics in cybersecurity, and we're also going to hold our AGM at some point in December. So if you're interested in joining our committee to make these events happen in the future, I'd be very happy to chat afterwards. We are basically for anybody interested in data, so no matter whether you're a student or a senior faculty member. We're always trying to get more diversity on our committee and get more diversity in our events lineup as well. So as a local group, you can find out more about us on our website, rss.org.uk/Merseyside. You can keep in touch with us through our social media, through our Facebook page and our Twitter account at RSS Merseyside. We also have a YouTube account where the recording of today's talks will take place. So I should have also said, sorry, today's talks will be recorded. So if you're seated toward the front, then the back of your head might be visible. If you've got any concerns about that, then please just let me know at the end of the session. So that you'll be able to find the recorded talks from today up there. We've also got a newsletter that you can sign up to find out not just about our events, but about other events relevant to statistics, mathematics, and data science that are happening locally. So to sign up to this newsletter, just simply go to this website, rss.org.uk/Merseyside. And I imagine that many of you will already be a member, but if you're not, then just to say that the Royal Statistical Society gives you access to events, training, networking opportunities, and there is also free e-membership available if you're a student. So I think that's quite enough from me as an introduction. So I'm now very happy to pass over to Professor Darren Wilkinson. So Professor Darren Wilkinson is, as of this year, Chair of Statistics in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at Durham University, having moved from a 25-year history with Newcastle University. He's also a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute, and he has a broad background covering mathematics, statistics, and systems biology. And his current research interests involve the application of Bayesian statistics to a variety of challenging big data problems in molecular biology and engineering. So I'm very much looking forward to finding out what Darren's going to tell us. Darren.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I was saying this is possibly my first ever visit to Liverpool, which I can't quite believe myself, but there we are. So it's really good to be here and be here in person. So yeah, I was really happy to take part in this meeting on real-time modeling. So what I'm going to talk about is streaming data modeling, and I'm going to say what I mean by all of these words here in the context of Bayesian inference for a challenging problem. So I thought it'd be a good idea to start off by explaining what some of these words mean. So what is streaming data? What are online algorithms? What do we really mean by real-time or near real-time modeling? And how do you work with this kind of data on a computer? So if you're used to a language like R, actually R isn't really a very natural place for working with streaming data. I mean, you probably can if you try hard enough, but it's not necessarily the most natural way to work with streaming data. So what would be a better way? What are good abstractions for thinking about streaming data and working with streaming data? And then once we know what we're doing, we're going to gradually link it to statistical inference, okay, statistical modeling problems, Bayesian inference in particular, and then I'll unpack it all in the context of a fairly challenging example on nowcasting big urban rainfall events. So I should say that all of this work that I'm talking about is joint with lots of people. So I've listed a bunch of names there. I won't read them all out. At the time, we were all at Newcastle University. I was looking at this on the train this morning, and the only person still at Newcastle, actually, is Kevin Wilson. All the rest of us have kind of gone off in other directions since then, but that's the way it is. Some of the early stuff is going to be related to my Turing project in this area, and the application on urban rainfall was a NERC project at Newcastle. Okay, so yes, you will hear the Newcastle cropping up. So this urban rainfall project was all based on Newcastle, and that's why historically I was at Newcastle. Okay, so everyone's heard of streaming. Okay, so especially if you've got kids are always talking about streaming. So what are they talking about? They're talking about things like Netflix and YouTube and Spotify, etc. Right? They're thinking about audio and video content being streamed over the internet to their device for them to consume in real time on that device. Okay, so a lot of streaming is like that. Okay, so it's about moving data, big data in particular, from place to place and working with that data kind of one kind of chunk of data at a time. Yeah, you don't need to have all of the data in one place. So if you're watching a movie on Netflix, you don't need to download the whole movie to your device and then watch it. Okay, you can watch it as the data streams to your device. But also, it's not just about the internet. You could download the movie to your device, but then when you watch the movie, you're still streaming it. Okay, even if you've got the movie or whatever downloaded to your device, it streams from the storage of that device and is decompressed on the fly and displayed to you. Yes, so you're never unpacking all of the data at once, right? And that is the key feature of streaming data. You're trying to work with the data as it kind of goes past. Yeah, so your data's streaming past. You're trying to do something with it, one bit or one chunk at a time. And sometimes you'll only get one look at the data, yeah? So once you've seen the data, that's it, it's gone, you can never look at it again, yeah? So it's streaming in that sense. So that's what we mean by streaming. But obviously it's not just about video and audio, it's about any kind of data. So a lot of this stuff actually has a long history in the context of financial services industries, in particular things like automated trading systems. So real-time analysis of stock data, for example, has been a big thing in the finance industry for a long time. And so automated trading systems, they work on streaming data. Every trade, as it goes by, they update their models, they buy, they sell on the basis of what their analysis is of the data as it streams through. Okay, so I'm more interested in sort of more scientific applications, and so in that context, a lot of modern scientific technologies generate huge amounts of data, and so there sometimes the challenge is not that you want to necessarily analyze the data sequentially, it's just that the data being generated is so big, again, you can't load it all into the RAM of your computer necessarily, and so you want to be able to process it in chunks as it flies by. Okay, and so a lot of biological sequencing technologies work like that. Some big neuroscience data, and of course we're all familiar with things like the Large Hadron Collider, etc. Most of the data from those experiments gets thrown away, right? It streams by, you get what you can out of it, and then it's gone, okay? A lot of it's stored as well for later analysis, but streaming data is associated with a lot of kind of modern big science as well. So what I'm going to be talking about later today is more related to this idea of real-time sensor network data for continuous monitoring. So we just have sensors and devices everywhere these days, recording stuff everywhere all the time. So I'll say a little bit later about this system called the Urban Observatory in Newcastle that has sensors all over the city, gathering data on the city all of the time. You want to be able to make sense of that data, but there's lots of it, right? So you don't necessarily want to be gathering it all in one place and running huge algorithms over huge data sets. You probably just want to be making sense of the data as it flies by in near real time. Okay, so what is a stream? So in this context, what I mean by a stream is basically just a possibly infinite sequence of values of a given type, okay? So it might be a frame of a video, it might be a snippet of audio or whatever, or it could be, you know, more mundane things like a temperature measurement, etc. So it's values of a particular known type with a definite order, yeah? So there's an order to the data. The order may or may not be important, right? So I'm, again, mainly going to be talking about time series examples where the data is really very important, okay? But in some cases, it's just that you want to analyze the data as it goes by, as it flies by, and really you don't care about the order. It's just this is the only way you can typically make sense of the data. So you access it one value at a time. You do your processing incrementally in some sense, and typically that processing is triggered by the arrival of each data value. Yeah? And this may be regularly in time, it may be irregularly in time, or it may be just as fast as you can process it. You know, there are lots of different sorts of systems, but typically the idea is you get a new data value that triggers some computation that you do, and you have some state that you're updating. I'll get into that in a second. We will often assume that you only get to see the data once, right? You can't get to the end and say, okay, actually, can I have another look at that data now and pass over the data again? Typically, you know, there are lots of algorithms where we want to do that, and sometimes we can, but in the kind of pure streaming data context, we don't allow that. And there are lots of things you can do with data streams, right? Especially if you've got this situation where you've got lots of different sensors, lots of different streams. You can merge them together, you can split them apart, you can rejoin them, you can fuse data points, you know, there are all kinds of things you can do with them. Typically, you imagine you've kind of arranged your data streams in the form of some kind of directed acyclic graph, and that, you know, data propagates through that graph, and, you know, some hopefully useful inference will pop out of the other end. So that's what people mean by a flow graph. So if you're working with this on a computer, there are lots of software frameworks for helping you think about and work with streaming data. So here are some of the names that crop up in this context. Interestingly, they nearly all run on the Java virtual machine for a variety of reasons. And they're typically built in languages that have good support for functional programming, such as a language that I quite like called Scala, and rely to a greater or lesser extent on principles of functional programming, in particular functional reactive programming. I'm not going to dive into the details of this today, but it's just useful to have in mind the kinds of things that people are thinking about in this context. Okay, so how do we process streaming data? Well, there are lots of ways we can process streaming data, but a really key abstraction is the notion of some advance function. Okay? So what do I mean by that? You have some function h, which takes in your current state, what you currently know about the world, okay? So this could be something very mundane, like a running mean or a running standard deviation, something like that, or it could be a full probability distribution in the context of Bayesian modeling, etc. But you have some representation of the state of the world as you understand it. You take in a new observation, and you get back an updated worldview, a new state, right? So this could be you've got a running mean, you get a new observation, you've got your updated running mean, or it could be you've got your current Bayesian probability distribution, a new observation, and a posterior that will then serve as the prior for the next observation, etc. Okay, so this idea of having some function that advances the state on the basis of a new observation is a good way of thinking about what a lot of streaming data applications look like, okay? So if you can capture the logic of your modeling in a function like this, you can then deploy this in one of these streaming data systems and everything will just run and work, hopefully. Okay, so just to, you know, think computationally about what's happening, you need some sort of initial state to initialize that. Then you need a sequence of observations, so we could call those a stream of observations, okay? And we're going to transform the stream of observations, that we could call y, to a stream of states x by just applying this advanced function repeatedly, okay? So you take the output of one call, you then combine that with your next observation, get your next state, then take your next observation, combine that with the current state to get your next state, etc. So that, in the context of functional programming, is called a scan operation, okay? And that will take a stream of observations and turn it into a stream of states, provided that you initialize it with an initial state. Okay, so that's a really nice framework to have in mind when you're thinking about what is an online algorithm. Okay, it's just something that takes a current worldview, an observation, and returns a new worldview. Okay, so there's lots of cool things you can do with streams. I don't want to get into all of that today, but just to be aware, you can map a stream. Okay, so if you've got a stream of things of type A and a function that turns A's into B's, then obviously you can apply that sequentially on the values of your first stream of things of type A to get a new stream of type B. So in the context of functional programming, that's called a functor. It doesn't really matter. It's just something you can map. Okay? This scan operation is this thing we really need in order to do our sequential Bayesian modeling. Okay? And what does that look like? Well, it says you need, if you've got a stream of type A's, okay, then you need an initial thing of type B, your advanced function, which takes a B and an A and gives you a new B, and then you will get back a stream of type B's. Okay, so you can work with all of these things very naturally in many computer programming languages. Again, if you use simple languages like R and Python, you may not be familiar with this, but there's no problem working with infinite things on computers. You just have to work with them lazily. Okay? So for example, you can just create the set of natural numbers by saying I'm going to start with 1 and create the infinite stream of numbers by adding 1. Okay? So that's then something that represents the infinite stream of natural numbers. You can get even numbers by doubling that stream, okay? So you can take that infinite stream, map it with a doubling function and get a new infinite stream, and you can use this scan operation, for example, to produce triangular numbers, okay? So you start with 0, you use the add function to get successive triangular numbers, okay? And, well, that'll start with 0, so you drop the first one to get the stream of triangular numbers, yeah? So working in a computer programming language with these infinite streams is perfectly natural as long as your language is set up to do this. And the key notions that we're going to need to have in our mind for this talk is the idea of mapping a stream, turning values from one type into another, or scanning a stream, which is this sequential updating operation to give you a new stream that has been transformed according to this advanced process. Okay, so we can work with these things on a computer. It's all fine as long as we're set up to do so. Okay, what's all this got to do with statistics? Well, a lot. But if we're thinking about Bayesian modeling, let's kind of get ahead of ourselves a little bit and just start immediately jumping in with state space modeling. So in state space modeling, you've got some kind of Markovian process. Okay, so maybe you've got a forward model defined by some transition kernel F, which tells you how the hidden state of your system evolves probabilistically in time. And you've got some sort of observation models, which says how your observation process relates to this underlying hidden state. And what do we do with that? Well, in various contexts, we can think about running a filtering process. Okay, so in the context of state space models, we think about things like particle filters and Kalman filters and things like that. In hidden Markov models, there are also forward algorithms and forward-backward algorithms, etc. They're all basically the same structure. So if you've got a state space model like this, well, what do you do with it? You normally do a predict and update. So you run your model forward one time step, ignoring the new observation. And then you use Bayes' theorem to condition on that new observation, and that's called your update step. Okay? So one step of a Kalman filter or a forward recursion would consist of a predict step and an update step. And again, we can encode all of this on a computer. So your one step is a composition of an update and a predict step, and so your advance operation just becomes the composition of your update operation and your predict operation, and that will give you one step of your updating algorithm. So we can map all of this onto probabilistic context. So here, your state is actually a probability distribution, okay? So again, if everything was Gaussian, you could represent a probability distribution just as a mean vector and a covariance matrix, right? If you had a discrete random variable, it'd just be a set of probabilities. Or you could have particle representations if you're doing particle filters, etc. But this probability distribution, P here, represents a probability distribution over things of type X, okay? And so we can represent those on the computer, and then our world state is then captured in a probability distribution over states. And we can update that in the usual Bayesian way, provided we've got some way of doing the Bayesian computation in a sequential way, okay? And again, it's all very natural if you set everything up in the right way. Okay, we're going to come back to this kind of model in detail later when we look at the application. Okay, so I've sort of glossed over lots of things to do with, you know, functional programming and stuff like that, but there's kind of lots of interesting stuff underlying that representing these models and updating operations as pure functions, representing probability distributions in your programming language, thinking about ways of manipulating those probabilistic programs in code, etc. Okay, so there are lots of connections between the things I'm talking about and probabilistic programming languages that, you know, we're not really going to get into in lots of detail today, but it's just useful to be aware of the connections. I think what's really important for today is that to get your head around the idea that this state space models and online algorithms are very natural things to think about together in this context. Yeah, a state space model is a canonical example of the kind of model that can be updated in this streaming data context. Okay, so lots of things that you will no doubt have heard of, things like Kalman filters, all of the different sorts of Kalman filters you may have heard of, particle filters, etc. They can all be operated in this streaming data fashion. Okay, right, so that's great, but what really is an online algorithm? So I've sort of hinted at it. I've basically said that an online algorithm is one that can be implemented using that advanced function. Yeah, you can take a current worldview, a new observation, get a new worldview, right? If you can do that, that's an online algorithm, and that basically is an online algorithm, but there are a few little wrinkles that you just have to think about a little bit. So the first thing to be clear about is that although lots of the nice examples are related to time series, really streaming data definitely doesn't have to be about time series. It's really just about where you have to do your analysis based on a single pass through the data. That's really what makes an algorithm a streaming data algorithm. But it's also worth noting that essentially any algorithm can be expressed in this form, okay, just not in a very productive way. Okay, so what you can do is you can make your state all of the data that you've seen so far, and when a new observation comes in, you can add that new observation to your current state to get all of the data you've seen so far, including the new observation, and your operation, your computation that you trigger can be, I'm going to analyze that data set using a dumb batch algorithm. Yeah? That then is still actually an online algorithm in some sense. It's just a really bad online algorithm. So why is it a really bad online algorithm? Well, it's really bad in two related ways. So the first is that your state is going to grow, right? So this internal representation of your state, of your world, is growing with each observation because you're just appending a new observation each time, and your internal representation is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's really bad because you're going to run out of memory at some point. But the other thing is that your computation will also typically be growing at each stage as well. So the amount of effort you have to put into analyzing the data will increase at each time point. Now, of course, the total amount of computation you do is always going to be related to the amount of data you've seen. That's okay. But what you don't want is the amount of computation to increase for each new data point. That then is going to lead to very bad behavior. So that's bad in two different ways. So we need, when we're thinking about online algorithms, we're not really thinking about algorithms like that. We're really thinking about where you've got a bounded state size, say, at least, again, at least bounded in expectation, but maybe even strictly bounded state size. And you also don't want the computational complexity of what you're doing at each time point to be increasing without bound. Either you'd like that to be bounded. Now, for slightly technical reasons, like a lot of Monte Carlo algorithms include like rejection samples and things, so you can't necessarily strictly bound the computation of many statistical algorithms, but you can at least bound them in expectation, okay? So there is an implicit assumption that when we talk about an online algorithm, we really mean that the state size is bounded and the computational complexity of each update step is at least bounded in expectation. That's what we mean by an online algorithm. Now, what's all this got to do with real time? Well, if you were in this situation where you've got what I've just called a real online algorithm, then you can obviously deploy that live and be confident that the processing time is not going to keep increasing as you process, yeah? And so you can deploy this in a live system in some sense. Now, is that real time or is it near real time? Well, that then is getting into semantics a little bit. So the finance people who run high frequency trading systems, right, when they talk about real time, they mean like crazy real time. They mean really bound this computational complexity and bound it quantitatively, like in milliseconds or occasionally even nanoseconds, right? That's not what I mean when I talk about real time. When I talk about real time, I just mean it's bounded and can be run in a live system. So in this system I'm going to talk about later, your observations actually only get updated every 5 minutes. And so as long as I can run my computation in 2 or 3 minutes, then I can deploy that live and the whole system works. And that would be probably what you call a near real-time algorithm rather than a kind of real-time algorithm that a financial trader, say, would recognize as such. Okay, so I hope that kind of sets the context. Okay. Right, so many of the applications that I'm interested in are spatio-temporal in nature, so they evolve in space and time. And the natural way to divide things up into a streaming algorithm in that context is divide them up according to time. I mean, you don't have to actually, but that is the natural thing to do. So you think about getting your observations updated sequentially in time. That's a very natural way to think about things. If your underlying stochastic process that you're trying to learn about has a Markov property in time, then that gives us something in the sort of state space modeling family, or more generally what you might call the partially observed Markov process family of models. And they are very natural, because what the Markov property does is it allows you to break up the computation, so you don't have to know everything that's happened in the past in order to do the next update, okay? So that's where we get these predict and update steps, and the reason that we can do that and that works and that gives you the correct Bayesian answer is precisely because this underlying process has this Markov property. That's why that works. So this actually is a very, very natural fit to the streaming data context, and that is going to be very much the example that we're going to be looking at shortly. But there are lots of other kind of spatio-temporal models. So another thing I looked at in the context of my Turing project were spatial temporal Gaussian process models. Okay, so we can set those up just as well, but there are lots of little wrinkles that arise in that case, because a lot of the kind of covariance functions you use in the context of spatio-temporal Gaussian process modeling, they don't actually lead to processes with very simple and strict Markov properties. Okay, they often lead to some kind of Markov property, but not like the simple, strict Markov property that, say, state space models have. And so you need to be a little bit careful about how you actually make these algorithms streaming and scalable in a sensible way. So we're not going to get into that today, but just to be clear that there is a big literature on that, and scalable GPs and streaming GPs is definitely a thing that you can just Google and find lots of interesting papers. Okay, so it is possible to make these algorithms online, but there's some work to be done. Right, so now I want to say a little bit about an application that I worked on for a few years. So this was a big NERC-funded project involving lots of people, lots of non-statisticians as well as statisticians, about basically building a demonstrator system to show how you could give local authorities warning of big flooding events in an urban area. And we were all at Newcastle at the time, so this was all based at Newcastle. And in fact, a lot of it was spawned from a huge flooding event that happened in 2012 in Newcastle, where basically there was just, one of these, once in, however many year storms that just dropped a whole load of water on the city. The whole city was flooded, and all of the emergency vehicles were trapped in their stations and couldn't get out because the roads outside of them were flooded. Okay, so none of the emergency vehicles could get anywhere to help anybody because they were flooded. Okay, so it was a kind of pretty disastrous thing that happened, and so they said, well, if they'd had an hour's warning, maybe they could have scattered the emergency vehicles around the city, and then, they would have then had a chance to be able to get to various different places that had been affected, yeah? So actually, the motivation was to basically give the authorities an hour or two's warning that a major flooding event was going to happen and where it was likely to happen. Okay, that was the motivation. Okay, so that's great. What data do we have? Well, we've got rainfall radar data. Okay, so that's nice and high resolution, so that's good. But it doesn't tell you exactly how much water is falling on the ground, right? It gives you an idea. It's nice and high resolution. It's nice and high resolution in both space and time, but it's not fantastically well calibrated to the water that falls on the ground. So actually, rain gauges on the ground are a much better indication of how much rain is actually falling at the ground, but they're very sparsely located in space. And so the idea was to fuse together this high resolution but not particularly well calibrated radar data with this much lower resolution but much more accurate point data in order to say something about the rain that was happening and to make short-term forecasts. Okay, so that's the motivation here. So the idea is that this data is coming in real time, and we need to analyze this data and make sense of it and do forecasts and predictions in real time. Okay? So what was actually going to happen with this forecast that we made was it was going to flow into a hydrodynamic urban flood model that was then going to actually make the predictions as to what bits of water were going to be where in the city. Yeah, I'll show you a picture of it later. But so this was one component of a much bigger system, is really what I'm saying. But the idea, our job here, was to do short-term prediction for the distribution of rainfall in the city over, say, a 2-hour window. Okay, so I think I've probably said a lot of this already now. Okay, yes, but if anyone is interested in this kind of data, it's all public. You can download it all. You can even stream it all if you talk to the right people. So it's urbanobservatory.ac.uk. And it's basically, you know, it's not just rain, it's like temperature, it's air pollution, it's traffic, it's kind of everything. So they're collecting data on the whole city and they're making it all available via APIs. It's kind of a cool data resource. Right, so, but our job is just to develop this spatio-temporal rainfall model. And so we want to be able to forecast rainfall intensity in near real time, okay? In high resolution in both space and time, so that we could feed that then into the flood model that will actually do the predictions of flooding. Okay, and yeah, that's all I want to say. So here's like a picture, right? So here's the northeast of England. This is the coverage of the rainfall radar, which is much bigger than the area that we need. We're going to model on this domain here. Actually, what feeds into the flood model is on a smaller region, but we're modeling on a bigger region in case of edge effects and things like that. So we can just feed in the middle bit into the hydrological model in order to do the predictions. Okay, so the idea is we've got this continuous radar data, or essentially continuous radar data, but we've got very isolated rain gauges scattered around. Can we combine these two data sources in order to forecast this rain field? Okay, so we need a statistical model. So we use this trick that's often used in rainfall modeling, right? Because it's very non-Gaussian. Because it's got this hard centering, right? It's either raining or it's not, and if it's not, you know, the standard sort of approximations you might do don't work very well. And so what people do is this so-called censored model, or which well, it does zero inflate, to be fair. But the idea is you imagine there's this continuous field, and negative values correspond to no rain, and positive values correspond to a rainfall intensity. And in some sense, how negative the value is sort of how far away you are from raining at the moment, but that's kind of a completely unobserved thing. All you can observe are the rainfall amounts or not raining. So it's a heavily censored and non-Gaussian model, which complicates absolutely everything. But that's the kind of picture to have in your head. We're going to have some lattice Markov spatio-temporal dynamics on this unobserved field. Okay? So the idea is that if we're thinking about a particular spatial location at time t+1, it's influenced not only by the corresponding spatial location at time t, but by its 4 nearest neighbors at time t as well. Okay, so there's sort of some spatial dependence in the structure of this hidden field, which is what's going to give us our spatial structure. It's kind of simple, but it's enough to get us going. Okay, so that's that. Yeah, so this is going to, it gives us what it's known as a star model, actually. I don't know if it says that on the slide anyway, a spatio-temporal AR model. But it gives us a nice, simple Markovian dynamics in the form of a dynamic linear model. So that's all good. So this unobserved field is all linear and Gaussian, yeah, because you've not imposed any censoring yet. So that's a nice, simple Gaussian evolution. And I've put G in quotes here, because this isn't G, this is the stencil that you can use to construct G, which is a big matrix, because these are like vectorized versions, etc. But you probably know what I mean. Okay. So we've got Gaussian dynamics. We need to factor the data in somehow. So remember we've got two sorts of data. We've got the gauge data and the radar data. So the idea is we've got these gauges. They're going to be mapped onto a particular grid cell that we're interested in. Obviously, lots of grid cells have no rain gauges, and some grid cells actually have more than one rain gauge, right? That's just the way it is. But we can have a simple mapping from rain gauges to grid squares that we're interested in. That's okay. And we're going to have our observations. And we've got to do this censoring process. So the way we do this censoring process is the same. We'll do this essentially same construction repeatedly. We imagine that there is this unobserved, real-valued thing that we're not able to measure, which is this rainfall if it's positive and how far you are away from raining if it's negative. Okay, so that's the Y. But then we're only going to observe the censored version of that, which is that we're going to observe this one with the tilde on. It's going to be 0 if actually the true thing that we can't measure is negative. But it's going to be the correct value otherwise. Okay, so this censoring operation is going to keep cropping up. Then we've just got a simple linear model relating our unobserved field to the actual gauge measurements. Expected. Okay, so that's all okay. That we do allow for some gauge-specific biases, right? Because some gauges are right in a rain shadow and that sort of thing. So it's not that this data is perfect either, right? But we assume it's sort of unbiased in some very vague sense if you look across all of the gauges. The radar data we need to factor in as well. So that's kind of interesting how we do that. What the radar gives us is a so-called reflectivity factor. And there are standard, well-studied ways of trying to relate that to the actual rainfall rate that we're interested in, okay? So this is the so-called ZR relation. And it's got two parameters in it, A and B, okay? And typically, if you look at the literature, the A values are sort of in this range and the B values are sort of in this range. To get things going, we just pick a value for A and B that is consistent with what we sort of believe for relatively heavy rainfall events in this part of the world. You might ask, if we're Bayesian, shouldn't we be just learning these from data? Well, we sort of indirectly do learn A from data because we're going to pick this A and B and we're going to fix them. But actually, we're then going to allow for a multiplicative bias in this data, which is actually going to be equivalent to learning A. So effectively, we do learn A, but we don't attempt to learn B in this work. There's enough going on and everything is sufficiently unidentifiable already that we don't even address this question of learning B. But we do sort of indirectly learn A, you'll see in a second. Okay, so same kind of censoring operation as before, and here you see we've got this multiplicative psi here that is relating the radar observation to the underlying field. So that's how we sort of indirectly, a value of 1 corresponds to the fixed value of A, and anything deviating from that is a different value of A. So we're sort of learning it indirectly. Okay, but it's the same kind of structure. Okay, so we put that all together, and it sort of looks like a big sort of dynamic linear model in some sense, but it's split up over multiple components. So if you prefer, you can just stitch it all together. Well, let's actually jump ahead to that. So if you just stitch all of the observations on top of each other, you can turn it into a big dynamic linear model. Okay, so if you're into dynamic linear models, this is what it looks like. Okay, so it's just a big dynamic linear model for the complete data. Obviously, this censoring process messes up everything, but if you ignore the censoring mechanism, it's just a gigantic dynamic linear model. Okay, so just to keep your kind of head around what's actually going on, the idea is, as I've said before, the radar data is giving us this useful high-level, high-resolution overview of where the rain is and where it's moving. That's very useful for doing forecasts. However, it's not fantastically well calibrated, and so this rain gauge data is useful for calibrating the radar data in terms of the actual water that's hitting the ground. Okay. Right. So then it's just Bayesian MCMC, and I don't have a huge amount of time left, so I'm not going to go into all of the details. But the idea is that you impute those censored observations. Yeah? So all of those zeros correspond to censored observations. You impute those by sampling them, okay, in a big MCMC algorithm, and conditional on them, you then have a complete data situation, and so everything then is simple and easy and Gaussian, and all of your favorite algorithms for working with big dynamic linear models work fine, yeah? So we're just going to do some MCMC algorithm where we switch between updating the parameters, updating the states, and updating the censored observations. That's basically it. And it all kind of works, but there are lots of little problems. So, yeah, we can sample these censored observations. That then gives us the complete data. We can then do things like, in principle, we could do like a Kalman filter to forward filter this dynamic linear model and backward sample. So that's a so-called forward filtering backward sampling algorithm. However, the state is so big that the matrices are so big that actually this isn't tractable at all. So in fact, we have to use the ensemble Kalman smoother to do this process approximately. And again, if you've not heard of this before, it's kind of cute. It's sort of halfway between doing kind of proper Kalman filtering and doing a particle filter. Yeah. So it uses sort of Kalman filtering ideas to adjust particles in a sensible way, but it avoids having to invert huge matrices. Yeah. But it's more efficient than a particle filter because it's doing this Kalman style adjustment of your particles, so you don't need as many particles as you would if you wanted to do a particle filter. Because the problem is you'd need huge numbers of particles to do a particle filter here as well. So in these big spatio-temporal problems, quite a few people quite like these ensemble Kalman filters and smoothers for doing approximate sampling. In principle, if you had a big enough computer, you could do it all exactly with Kalman type recursions, but in practice, it's much easier to use these ensemble Kalman smoothers. But I think in the interest of time, I'm going to ditch that. So we can do it. We can, see how well it works on held back rain gauge observations and things like that, and we can make sure that it's all working okay. And then we have to deploy it, right? So this is how it all works. Okay, so we want to deploy this into a live demonstrator system that's running in near real time. But although I glossed over the MCMC algorithm very quickly, it's probably clear that there was some static parameters in there and that we were going to have to run a big MCMC algorithm that was going to take a long time to run. That is correct. So a bit of this problem is run offline but regularly, say every few hours. Yeah, every few hours we will rerun the MCMC algorithm on the basis of some recent data in order to get updates of the static parameters. But conditional on the static parameters, we can more or less just run the ensemble Kalman smoother. However, there's still a slight wrinkle, even with just running the ensemble Kalman smoother, because of the censored observations, right? So you can only really do this Kalman smoother on the complete data version of the problem, and we don't have the complete data. So we actually, even conditional on the static parameters, we still have to do a few updates of our MCMC algorithm in order to switch between sampling the censored observations and the normal observations. But conditional on the static parameters, the mixing is actually incredibly fast, so there's actually not a big issue in doing that. So there is no problem getting this to run in a minute or two, which is fine given our 5-minute frequency of observation. So there are lots of wrinkles to actually getting this to work, but you can actually get it to work. It then goes into the hydrological flood forecasting model, and then that's run to actually do the decision support. So this is the kind of thing that happens when you feed it into the flood model, right? So the blue corresponds to water, and the darker the blue, the deeper the water. this is like 1 hour after a big rain event starts, then there's 2 hours, and then there's 3 hours, right? So you see that the floodwaters don't, spread uniformly over the city, right? There are particular hotspots that are most likely to get flooded, and that obviously depends on where the rain is falling and where it's flowing and how it's draining away, etc. But this is all in the flood model, right? So, but this is forced by the forecast that we generate from the rainfall forecasting model. So, let me quickly wrap up then. In terms of this application, these censored continuous fields can be super useful for spatial data containing lots of zeros. Rainfall is a classic example, but actually there are quite a few others. I personally quite like these big lattice Markov spatio-temporal models because they're quite easy to kind of cast into this DLM framework, and I kind of know how DLMs work. There are lots of computational challenges associated with these big models, and it is worth knowing about these ensemble Kalman filtering algorithms because they can be usefully embedded into Bayesian parameter inference algorithms, and they can reduce your computational demands significantly. And the sort of more general streaming data modeling summary, as was mentioned in the introduction, being able to work with streaming data is becoming an increasingly important skill, increasingly important problem scientifically. The typical motivations we've seen are sort of sequential analysis of live data in near real time, but that's not the only motivation. Sometimes you just want to be able to analyze a really big data set in one pass. And there are lots of kind of motivations related to parallel computation as well, because if you've got a stream, you can split the stream, you can analyze the different bits separately and then merge everything back together, so it's a kind of a route into parallel computation as well. There are lots of models and software libraries for working with streaming data. It's definitely worth learning about these if you're going to be working with streaming data a lot, because it really helps actually just structure your thinking as much as practically helps you work with the data. And time series models are a very natural fit, but not everything is temporal. But actually lots of other statistical models and algorithms can be adapted to this context. So that's it. I hope I haven't overrun too much. Thank you.
We'll move on to our second speaker of the day. So I'd now like to introduce Professor Peter Neal. So Peter is Professor of Statistics at the University of Nottingham, where he joined in 2020 following a professorship at Lancaster University. His research background is in infectious disease modelling, and his work has focused on statistical inference, incorporating population structure into epidemic models. His interests also cover developing and optimizing algorithms to estimate parameters in Bayesian frameworks. So we'll hear some more about that if I select the right slides. Let me pass over to Professor Peter Neal.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's excellent to finally be here. The invite came to me in January 2020. At that point, I had heard of COVID, just an emerging disease in China. A little did I know at that time that it would be such an inspiration to my own research, and also delay coming here to give a talk. So what I'm going to talk about today is some research I've done, which has been inspired by the COVID-19 outbreak. Hopefully take you through this is, I should say, work in progress. So some of the results certainly I'll show you at the end, improving on, hopefully as we speak, on my home computer. But really sort of taking you through a bit of the voyage I've gone on, sort of inspired by some questions arising from COVID, looking at these, first of all, in quite a sort of probabilistic mathematical way, and actually the knock-on effect to calculating likelihoods, inference, and moving into real time. So I'm going to start off, say, with my motivating question. I'm going to introduce you to the general stochastic epidemic model. As Darren has already mentioned in his excellent talk, a lot of the time when we're wanting to talk about real time, we're looking at Markovian models, and this is going to be a Markovian model. And what I'm going to do is also present an approximation. Birth-death process, branching process approximation has been used for epidemics for 70 odd years. They're very simple approximation, but we can see how they can be very useful, not just as a modelling tool, but also from inference. And then I'm going to talk about two very different diseases on two very different populations. I'm going to start off with, in one sense, one of the most irrelevant diseases, smallpox, one of only 2 eradicated diseases, and look at an outbreak of 30 people infected in a population of 120. So really small, localized community outbreak. Then we'll come on to talk about COVID-19 and look at the spread of COVID in the early stages in Europe. In particular, I'm going to focus on 11 countries. So I'm talking about hundreds of millions of people being our population. And then just a few concluding remarks. So where do I start? At the start of the COVID outbreak, I was under a lot of pressure with work in one sense, with all of a sudden having 3 primary school aged children at home. So when the children then went back to school sort of 2 years ago, I was interested by the question, okay, when should we introduce control measures in school? In other words, when should we shut them down? So if you see one case in a school, should you act then? Or should you wait until you see second, third, so on? So what was sort of part of the motivation behind that? So we'll all be familiar with the R number these days. I would typically use R0 to talk about basic reproduction. So I'm thinking about a situation where perhaps this represents our initial setting, just as the disease is emerging, or in situations where I'm assuming that the parameters are constant over time, this is going to be a constant reproduction number. So all it's going to represent is, if I have a typical individual, on average, how many other people would they infect if they're infectious or make infectious contact with. And initially, if everybody's pretty much susceptible, all or most contacts are going to be with susceptible individuals, and this is going to be the average number of people they infect. Obviously, what we'll see is, as the disease takes off, we get a diminishing pool of susceptibles, so the amount of infections that one person can cause is diminished. So if I have an R0 value, even if R0 is bigger than 1, and the common mantra over the last couple of years, if we've got an R number bigger than 1, that's bad, smaller than 1, that's good. But what does this mean if we're looking, say, at a school outbreak, an introductory case? Well, actually, even if your reproduction number is greater than 1, by chance you might only see 1 case or a small number of cases. So for the general stochastic SIR epidemic, which I'll describe in a minute, the probability of extinction, so the disease will in a sense die out early, is given by 1 over R0. And more to the point, the probability of just seeing 1 case is given by 1 over R0 plus 1. So we take R0 to be 2. There's a 50% chance the epidemic will die out without us doing anything. And actually, there's a probability a third that we'll see just the 1 case. So we might not want to be jumping in the moment we see 1 case, but perhaps when we see the second or the third, and perhaps the time in between those cases will help us decide whether it's worth actually taking action or not. So there's going to be a cost from taking action, but there'll also hopefully be benefits. And costs could be financial, it could be in terms of saving lives in the most sort of extreme case. So it's always a sort of balancing act about what should we do. So when we think about the question of when to introduce control measures, and here I'm talking about what I often refer to as NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions. This really depends upon how many people are infectious with the disease. So what can we actually say about how many people are infectious? Well, typically we don't know how many people in the population are infectious with the disease. What we typically will see is some cases where the detection, where people are detected, where they start showing symptoms. So it's often perhaps at the stage where people show symptoms and we can perhaps take action to remove them from the population that we know the case. But with COVID, as with many diseases, we've got asymptomatic cases, or just cases where people are not sufficiently ill to go and see a doctor, have the results recorded, especially if we're thinking about the early stages, less so perhaps during times of mass testing. So what can we say about the distribution of the unobserved number of infectious people? So I'm going to actually describe the SIR model. So we're going to look at a time in a homogeneous model. So I'm going to allow my parameters to be varying over time. I'm essentially going to have three key parameters. I'm going to have an infection rate. So infection rate is going to be what drives the passing on of the disease, so the transition from individuals being susceptible to becoming infected. So use beta t, so t is just going to be throughout my time index. So what I'm assuming here is that an individual, well, if they're infectious, they're making contact at some rate beta t. If the person they contact is a susceptible individual, they'll pass the disease on, and that person becomes immediately infectious. So I'm not looking at a situation where we've got a latent period here. So a time between when I become infected and when I'm yet infectious. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, the inclusion of a latent period, often referred to in these models as an exposed state. I've been exposed to the disease, but I'm not yet infectious and able to pass it on. We have our removal rate, so that's the rate at which I'm moving from being infectious to removed, and that might be removal through recovery, no longer infectious. It might be because I've been detected with the disease and in a sense removed from the population, quarantined, or some other action. And that's going to be rate gamma t. And finally, as I say, we might not want to assume that everybody who has the disease is detected on removal. So I'm just going to have a detection probability dt. Again, this can be time dependent. So that could very well be sort of driven by, are we actually out looking for the disease? Especially for very many newly emerging diseases, people aren't necessarily aware or necessarily looking for that. Once we introduce mass testing, we'll also be able to pick out, asymptomatic cases as well as those who are obviously showing clear symptoms. And if we're interested in the now infamous R number, that's just going to be a ratio of beta t over gamma t, the relative rate at which I'm going out infecting people relative to my recovery rate. A more important quantity in many ways is the growth rate, the difference between beta t and gamma t. If this is positive, that's bad news. The number of people infectious is generally increasing. If it's negative, that's generally good news. And we can see why this might be more important. Diseases like HIV/AIDS can have actually quite a high reproduction number, but they have a very slow transmission rate. So you've got, in a sense, much more time to do something about it. Whereas if you have a disease, even if it's got an R number just a little bit bigger than 1, if you've got a very high beta and gamma, you've got rapid growth of the disease. So what can we infer about the population if we only observe the removal times of detected individuals? So just a couple more things to sort of say about the model. So I'm assuming I've got a closed population of size n, actually for what I'm going to move on to, and especially the birth-death process approximation, that is actually going to be pretty irrelevant. We could very much weaken that. I'm going to assume that the infection removal rates are piecewise constants between detection of removals. Again, this is probably going to be generally quite reasonable. It's fairly easy to change some of the arguments to the case where that's not strictly true. Initially, I'm just going to assume that all removals are detected, and when I talk about smallpox, I'll be looking at that case. So that's just saying that throughout I'm setting dt equal to 1. When we come on to the COVID modelling, I'll assume that dt, detection probability, is less than 1. So if we've got this scenario, we can actually calculate the distribution of the number of affected individuals at time t, just given the removal times. What does this involve? It involves matrix multiplication. I'm actually going to give you the likelihood we can derive in a minute, and matrix exponentials. And these will be up to matrices of size n by n. So what we can see here is it's going to depend upon the population size. But it's actually relatively straightforward to write down the likelihood of the removal times, so our observed data. But what we'll see is that it's actually going to be something which is going to be very computationally expensive to compute. And that's going to be part of why the first data set I'm looking at is this smallpox data set in a very small population, because there we can actually do calculations and compare what is, in a sense, an exact model with its approximations. So just some terminology. So I'm just going to let Ti denote the removal time or the time between the I minus first and ith removal. So it's the inter-arrival of detected cases, which is going to be major driver. And if we've got some time, capital T here, I'm just going to let R of t just denote the number of removals up to time t. Then I've got my parameters theta, so that's going to be just my infection rate and removal rate and how they vary over time. And also it could depend, when we come on to look at more general models, the probability of detection. But for now I'm just going to set this equal to 1. So we have our likelihood, which takes the following form, and the Q's here are various matrices. So what are they? So my vector U1 at the front there is just a vector whose first entry is 1 and all the rest is 0. And that corresponds to saying I assume I start off with a single person infected. And we could just replace this by a more general vector if we assumed a distribution over how many initial cases we might have. 2, 3, or so on. And finally, I have a vector of 1s at the end, and I noticed on the way over here that that capital N should just be a lowercase n. It's just, again, the population size. So what are these matrices here? So how it works is we have a Markov process, and in between observing removals, what's happening in a population? So we'll have a certain number of people infected, and we'll have a rate of infection, probability that somebody will become infected in the next interval of time. And so we'll transition through from, say, 3 infectives to 4 infectives to 5 infectives, and then we'll observe a removal event. And we'll sort of move on to the next state, which is the state where we've seen one more removal. So I don't want to go through these in any great detail, but the key point is we can write down the likelihood. We can write it down in certainly mathematically, quite a nice, concise form. But the problem is we're dealing with potentially very large matrices, especially if our population size is not 120. But if we look at the population of the UK, for example, 66 million, we don't really want to be taking the exponential or here at the front we've got an inverse. That's going to be a lot of work to calculate. So even if we started looking at this, thought about actually, what about if we use branching process, birth-death process approximation? So how does this differ from the epidemic process? So it makes the assumption that each infectious contact is successful. As I say, this idea dates back to 1940s, 1950s. So if we think about, say, a large population, let's consider Liverpool, and I'm the first infective bringing in a new exotic disease, then anybody I contact is going to be susceptible, and I'll have a chance of passing the disease on. And assuming that I infect you, you all live in different areas, you can then have the opportunity to go out and meet lots of different people and pass the infection on. As long as we don't have sort of local interactions, then what we can see is the epidemic could actually grow in this way, with everybody contacting somebody who's susceptible until quite a few people are infectious. And how large does the epidemic need to get before we start to see a substantial number of people trying to reinfect people who've already been infected? Well, it's related to the birthday problem, which is the question of how many people do you need in a class until you have two people having or sharing a birthday. And looking in here, we're probably about at the cusp where there's probably a 50-50 chance that two people in here share a birthday. So say this is reasonable if we've got a large susceptible population and we make a homogeneous mixing assumption. In other words, I'm equally likely to contact anybody in the population. Another way of thinking about it is we haven't got lots of these sort of local interactions which sort of impede the disease. Because, as I say, when we introduced the model to start with, said I'm going to allow the rate to be time varying, and I'm actually going to allow my birth-death process to have a time varying rate, we can actually sort of take into account any reduction in susceptibles by having a birth rate, which we can equate to infection rate, beta tilde t, which is perhaps our true sort of interaction rate, beta t, how often I'm contacting somebody, multiplied by a factor which represents, well, actually how likely is the person I'm going to contact to be susceptible. So our representation looks very much as we had before. Births corresponding to infection, going to denote this beta t. From the point of view of the disease, any time somebody recovers, is removed from the population to pass on the disease can see that as a death. Not able to transmit anymore. That's going to be a gamma t. And in the sort of the birth-death process notation, rather than talk about detection of a removal, I'll just talk about detection of a death, probability dt. So just a bit of notation. So if I just sort of rescale time so that my first death is at time 0, we can have the interarrival times of deaths as before, T2, T3, and so on. So T2 is the time from the first death to the second, and so on. And I'm just going to use SK to denote the sum of these, so the actual time of the kth death. Now, what we can show is actually the number of people alive at the time of the kth death follows a negative binomial distribution with parameters Rk and some success probability Q. So I should say this is a mixture of negative binomial. So first of all, if we look at this Q probability, we notice it depends upon SK, so it depends upon the time of the case death. But it only depends upon that time. It doesn't depend upon when you've observed the deaths in the meantime. And actually, to get this, it's a simple ODE to solve, to compute this. The RK here is a discrete random variable, which when k equals 1, we've just seen one death, is just 1. And it's quite well known fact that for this model, you have a geometric number of individuals alive at the time of the first death. And then for subsequent k, it's just a discrete random variable which has support on values 2 up to k. And in particular, its probability mass function does actually depend upon the inter-arrival times of the deaths. So why is this useful? Well, we can actually set up a recursive way of calculating the distribution of RK. So I'm just going to let BK denote its probability mass function, and we can compute BK plus 1 as just PK, which is a vector of length k minus 1, times some matrix. And that matrix essentially consists of binomial terms. But its form is not particularly important here for us. But one thing to note is actually computing the distribution of RK, so how many people are alive, or if we're using this to model the number of people who are infectious, this just depends upon how many infections we've seen up to this point, or how many detections. It doesn't depend upon the population size. So with our previous calculations, the exact ones will depend upon n. And as I say, if we're using that for the UK, 66 million, that's going to be very daunting. Here, if we're looking at, say, the first 1,000 or 2,000 cases, we're only dealing with matrices up to essentially 1,000 by 1,000 squared or 2,000 by 2,000 squared. And what's more, so I'm going to look at, just for the time being, a simplified version where I'm going to assume that parameters are time homogeneous, so fixed over time. So just fix my infection rate beta t equal to alpha and gamma t equal to mu. What we can do is we can actually just write down the likelihood of the death times we observe. And this has quite a similar form to what we saw previously for the exact likelihood for the general stochastic epidemic. So here my kt is just how many deaths I've seen up to time t, which just replicated how many removals. And what we had are some quite simple terms to calculate. So our g of t is just an exponential term, and the other terms in the likelihood essentially just related to the probability generating function of rk minus 1. So that was this discrete random variable which was informing the negative binomial distribution. So what's nice about this is we can write down the likelihood. But as Darren was rightly mentioning in his talk, what we're interested on if we're looking at online real time is, as we get more data, that our likelihood calculations don't become more complex. But we have a problem here that, say, the support of RK is the numbers 2 up to k. So as we get more and more observations, these calculations become more and more involved for each successive value of k. So what we considered doing was, way around that, is to say, well, actually, let's just use a Gaussian approximation. So once an epidemic's taken off, once we've perhaps got 100 or 200 cases, our discrete distribution might look, we might hope it looks, actually pretty Gaussian. So if we store the mean and the variance, essentially of RK, or an approximation of that, what we can do is update these iteratively. So rather than having something which essentially grows quadratically in K, hopefully we've got something which will increase in terms of computation linearly. So hopefully I've given you a whistle-stop tour through this time in a homogeneous birth-death process. But what were the key things we wanted for it to give us? So an estimation of the number of infectives at time t, given only partial sort of removal data. So I've mentioned in the case where I assume all the removals are detected, the calculations we had on the previous slide don't become much more complicated if we allow dt to be less than 1 and if we allow the parameters to change but be piecewise constant. Important thing from a sort of modelling perspective is, if we're looking at COVID or some other disease, we want our model to be able to just easily react to changes. So for example, known changes, introduction of government measures of control, or depletion of susceptibles. Once the epidemic has certainly got hold and we've got a serviceable amount of depletion. But we might also want the removal rates to change. If we've got increased surveillance and we're picking out the asymptomatic cases, then typically individuals will actually spend less time infectious out in the community. A lot of the work which has been done on infectious disease modelling is because we typically observe just that I to R transition when somebody shows the symptoms, something like measles, nice rash, so we know to remove them, but we don't know when they become infected. The calculation of the likelihood here does not require us to guess, impute any of the infection types. As say, we allow for just actually a partial observation of the death process or removal process. The only real sort of key assumption is that the probability of detection is independent for each event. It might be time varying as we do increased testing, but it's otherwise independent. A number of these things can hold over to the general stochastic epidemic model. I described it initially as constant parameters, but we could allow the parameters there very easily, for example, to change between detection events. Okay, so let's actually have a look at this with a couple of data sets. So say smallpox, nicely eradicated disease. So the data set I'm going to take is very much a toy example which has been looked at by many before, and it's outbreak in Abakaliki, Nigeria. So 30 cases in a population of 120, and the epidemic was completed 76 days after the first case. So many people have looked at it before, including myself, basically used a variety of Bayesian algorithms, so MCMC, forward-backward filtering, more sophisticated MCMC, importance sampling. What I should say, and certainly when I looked at this data in the past, most of the work has been done looking at it once the epidemic has been completed. But obviously, if we're going to intervene in an epidemic, we want to be making inference as the epidemic is ongoing. So that's going to be one of my main focuses here. So what other assumptions are we going to make? I'm going to assume that all removals, and if I'm using my birth-death approximation, deaths are detected. I'm assume that the infection rate and removal rate are not changing over time. And this is primarily to allow comparison with previous results. So questions. I'm talking in a session for Bayesian real time. One of the things is, I'm going to say, why not be frequentist? And what we're going to see is there's actually a very good reason not to be with epidemic data like this. And I've introduced an approximation. The question always is it any use? So starting off with why not be frequentist. So here what we've got is a contour plot of the likelihood at day t equals 90. So this is a fortnight after the last observed case. So 30 cases of smallpox have been detected over a 76-day period. Apart from the gap between the first and the second observed case, all the other arrivals were less than 5 days or less apart. So this is quite some time after the last case. So what we've got here is my alpha parameter going from 0 to 0.25 and mu going between 0 and 0.2. So mu being 0.2 would say that the average length of time somebody is infectious is 5 days. Mu being 0.1, average length of infectious period 10 days. Alpha being 0.1 says for each day that I'm infectious, I've got a 1 in 10 chance, essentially, of infecting somebody. So we've got the contour plot. So the darker the colour, the higher the likelihood. And so what we can see is we've got a lot of mass here on the likelihood, where mu is very small, and alpha sort of going from 0.1 upwards. We've got a second mode around here. So approximately around the point sort of alpha equals 0.1, mu equals 0.1. So what's going on? The MLE is down here. All previous analysis of this outbreak has given parameter estimates corresponding to this sort of second mode. If we look at the ongoing epidemic, so I've taken T here to be 46.99. The data, I should say, in this case is given discretely, and I've just treated it as, in a sense, discrete data in terms of the time, that the 16th observation is at time 47. If we follow, for example, at least one of the references, which then imputes the actual removal time as being sometime on that particular day. Again, we have that a lot of the likelihood is at its highest. Again, for small values of mu and alpha along here. We can see that the likelihood surface has sort of a bit of a banana type shape. We haven't got that distinction we had before. We go back where we have a sort of clear separation between two modal behaviours. So what's going on here? So it's not until after t equals 90, so more than 2 weeks after the actual last observed case, that the MLE moves away from this high alpha, low mu mode, so MLE. And it's about 0.115, 0.004. I've not looked to dig into it any more than that. I should have said that the grid I used to produce the likelihood plot, I did 100 by 100 grid. It wasn't quite evenly spaced. I took a few more of the low mu values so I could capture that this behaviour at the low mu. So what does this correspond to? This corresponds to a basic reproduction number of 38.75, saying that a large number of people will have been affected before the first removal was observed, and almost certainly by day 90, everybody's been affected. We're just waiting, essentially, to see the removal of the other individuals. And the MLE doesn't really change much if we look at that earlier time point at 46.99. So if we use priors which have been used previously in the literature on alpha and mu, which are gammas with shape parameter 10. So for mu, a gamma 10, 100. This is a prior which will have mean 0.1, which corresponds to an average infectious period of 10 days. The 10, 500 over 6 I'm going to come on to in a minute. That might seem a slightly odd choice. So, how long did it take me to calculate those likelihoods? So, as I say, I was doing a 100 by 100 grid, so 10,000 likelihood calculations, and in R, on quite an old PC, it took me 45 minutes, so not too bad. So if I used the birth-death process approximation, I haven't said how I approximate the actual number of susceptibles. It's quite easy to do, based on sort of estimating how many people are infectious. We know at any point in time how many people are removed. To repeat these calculations, it just took me 35 seconds. So approximately 77 times speed up. As I say, the essential cost here is quadratic in the epidemic size, whereas the calculations of the sort of exact likelihood depend upon the population size. If I use the Gaussian approximation, that went down to just taking me 3 seconds. So a 900 times speed up, and as I say, this is essentially linear in the size of the epidemic. So let's have a look at how these compare. And as I say, to point out, I in particular chose the Apple-Leaker data because we could actually do the exact calculations. If I even tried to go up to a population of 200, 250, I noticed a real slowing down at the exact calculations. So here's the plot we had before of the exact contour plot. I'll flick over. Here's what we get with the 3-second approximation. So what we see here is the likelihood is perhaps a bit more diffuse, especially around the second mode, and at the high alpha, low mu, where my approximation of the number of people susceptible is not as good. It's designed more for what I might call the more realistic situations. We don't quite get to the same heights in our density. Again, we can look at what happens much more when the epidemic is in progress. So the 46.99, day 46.99. Again, what we see is the approximation is a little bit more diffuse. But it's got the same sort of shape and, say, much quicker calculations. If we come onto the Bayesian and combine this with the prior I mentioned before, so the prior on alpha, if we look at actually prior on alpha over n, over the population size, quite a few people have looked at this as the sort of the person-to-person contact rate. How often am I contacting a given individual? That corresponds to a gamma 10 over 1,000. 10, 1,000. So the rate at which I'm contacting any particular individual has a prior mean of 1 over 100. So if we combine that, then we get the following posterior plot using the exact likelihood. And certainly if you look at the paper by Paul Fernhead, which I referenced early on, this is essentially identical to the plot which appears there. We look at the approximation. Again, it looks quite reasonable. The posterior doesn't quite get to the same height. It's a bit more diffuse. But for something which takes 3 seconds rather than 45 minutes, it looks perfectly reasonable. Now if we look at going back, in a sense, back in time, if we look at time 46.99, what we see is, again, as we might expect, this is earlier in the epidemic, we've got more uncertainty, so our posterior, again, looks more uncertain. So this is the exact one, and again, we can see just a bit more spread out when we use the approximation. So in the last few minutes, I want to sort of go to where I'm wanting to get to, and very much the sort of work in progress. So using the exact calculation of the likelihood, say, was manageable for Abakaliki, outbreak of 30 in a population of 120. We look at COVID-19, and I'm just going to take, for reasons to become clear, up to the beginning of May 2020, we'd seen over 28,000 deaths in the UK, 180,000 odd cases, and a population of 66 million. I wouldn't dare attempt the exact calculation. The birth-death process approximation with multiplication of the matrices, that might be possible on, if written in another program other than R, and on something more sophisticated than my home PC. But the actual Gaussian approximation, we can work with there. And in particular, if we wanted to scale this up, going beyond just looking at one country, but looking at multiple countries, as say, present results for 11 European countries, or we could scale this up to the world. So just to give you an idea what we're looking at, so these are the number of reported deaths per day in the UK. So the first death from COVID-19 was reported on the 8th of March 2020. You can see just a slow increase to start with, reaching a peak in early April, and then we're starting to see some decline after that. What you'll notice is every 7 days there seems to be a drop. UK reporting is very much of a weekday effect. Saturday and Sunday we see as lower. Just for comparison, here we have the outbreak in Italy, which generally took off earlier. So the first death was the 24th of February, first known reported one. And we can see the early growth of COVID-19 in Italy, and then we can see the drop-off as we come into April. So after the introduction of various control measures. So the question I want to look at is, what effect did individual control measures have on potentially reducing the transmission of COVID-19? And we're looking at the data up, as I say, to the 4th of May. So why have I chosen this? This is a scenario considered by a paper by Flaxman et al. So a group of scientists at Imperial, and their paper appeared in Nature. It's got many citations. Yes, their model is actually quite different to this, but it was just a proof, can we actually apply our model? And I'll admit our model is wrong, but hopefully at least it's useful and indicative to give us some indication. And the reason for choosing the 4th of May is that control measures started to be relaxed on that date. So Italy and Spain started relaxation, and other countries then followed suit. So we can see this up to the 4th of May as the early emergence of COVID-19, followed by the implementation of control measures. So the data I'm going to use is, as I've just shown, the reported deaths rather than case count. Two reasons for that. One is death data tends to be more reliable. The second one, from a statistical or sort of computational point of view, is there are fewer deaths than cases, and so that speeds things up. So how do we model infection? So I'm going to assume that each country has its own baseline initial infection rate, and beta Ti is just going to denote its infection rate at day T, which will depend upon its baseline and control measures. Should say, since producing the results here, we looked at extending the model so that we also have a sort of relative effect of how effective control measures are in the countries overall, because with the current model, if you have an initial higher infection rate, essentially throughout you'll have a higher infection rate. A sort of constant removal rate, and this reflects the fact that during the initial stages of the pandemic, we've got a single strain which will have common properties across countries, and again comes to parsimony. We'll allow for a common probability of death due to COVID-19. Now this will very much be, again, country dependent, but actually these results are very insensitive to varying this parameter delta. And essentially it comes down to you're going to get the same sort of behaviour if you observe 10% of the case deaths as if you observe 5% or 20%, because you're just throughout observing a given fraction. What's quite interesting, haven't fully checked it with COVID-19, but with smaller data sets, what you can do is use this model to detect a change in the detection probability or probability of death. So what are some more of the assumptions? We're dealing with the early stages. 28,000 deaths is a lot. 180,000 cases is a lot in the UK. But if we're talking about a population of 66 million, 600,000 or thereabouts is 1%. So I'm going to assume there's no real serious depletion susceptible. Could be questionable, but pretty easy to change that. After the initiation of COVID in each country, assuming that it emerged, the evolution is independent. Probably not too unreasonable given the restrictions and lockdowns in place. Only control measures affect transmission rates, and these have a common effect across country. Again, this is debatable, but if we're wanting to sort of borrow strength across countries, we'll start from that assumption. So say a common infectious period distribution and death probability. One other thing is that when we actually detect cases, when somebody dies from a disease, will not necessarily be the same thing. So typically there's a delay, and the delay is on average for COVID, especially in the initial stages, of about 18 days. So I'm actually going to take it that essentially what we're observing is a realisation of what was happening 18 days ago. It's easy enough to, rather than just assuming a fixed amount, to put a distribution on that. And if you put, for example, a gamma distribution, what that tends to do is actually smooth the number of actual cases per day. So what were the control measures which were introduced? Well, these vary in part between countries, but following Flaxman et al. Sort of classify them into 5 main categories. Self-isolation, the encouragement of social distancing, a ban on public events, large gatherings, closure of schools, and lockdown. Say, looked at 11 countries, only Sweden didn't employ all of these at some point during March 2020. As sort of famously or infamously, Sweden didn't impose a lockdown. And lockdown was usually the last measure to put in place. So say, since actually producing this, I looked at extending the results. So following Flaxman et al., looking at actually having some factor which sort of determines the rate at the end of the epidemic after the last case, and also introducing a control measure which is the government's done something. Because what you actually tend to see is once the government has taken some sort of action, people start to think actually this might be serious, and you already see a reduction in infection. So how do we model the control measures? So I'm just going to allow the control measure effect to vary between 0 and 1. 0 means that it completely eradicates transmission. 1 means it has no effect. So it's just going to be a multiplicative factor on the transmission rate. And the omega ijt is just an indicator. Is that control measure J, in place in country I on day T? Some exploratory analysis suggested that the public event ban, so my eta 3 parameter, was essentially equal to 1. So what I've done is actually just looked at the other 4 parameters. Started off by actually putting a prior on R0. Started off with all the R0 values equal to 3 and all the control measure equal to 0.7 for running my MCMC. And just to say, running the MCMC and computer 80,000 iterations took about a day. So what we've got here is estimates of R0. These are on the lower side of what's typically reported in the literature, and there are some reasons for that. In part, the way some of the parameters say have taken to be fixed. Say this is more to illustrate what can be done. We have estimates of the different effects. We can see lockdown has the biggest effect, basically sort of looking to halve the transmission rate. Social distancing measures looks to actually be quite significant here, a reduction of 2/3, whereas the school closure, self-isolation, bit less effect. And actually, if we look at all control measures, actually there we have a very small sort of standard deviation. So what we tend to see is, as you might expect, if in our MCMC run, one parameter goes up slightly in terms of effective control measure, another one comes down to compensate for that. And then what we can do is produce estimates of R0 or RT over time. So for the UK, going from sort of 3.5 initially, and then as we see various measures being brought in, we can see it being reduced. So the full sort of green gives a 95% credible interval, the darker green, sort of the middle 50%, and the darkest green, if you can make it out, gives the median. And we can do the same thing for Italy. In the case of Italy, some control measures such as self-isolation and social distancing were introduced on the same day. So we can see those combined. Okay, so just sort of some final remarks. So say all models are wrong, and this is still sort of work in progress. Ideally, what we'd like to be looking at is an SEIR, so have that exposed state, go moving from being susceptible to initially exposed to infectious, and to move beyond exponential. Better ways of sort of dealing with some, so say I've taken some of the parameters to be fixed, again coming back to initial questions of sort of identifiability. With the simulation study, it looks as if actually we can, at least if the model is the correct model, identify these parameters. So whilst it might be wrong, hopefully it's useful. Say, we've gone from sort of the exact calculation of the likelihood through to an approximation, which can be implemented just on a PC for 120,000 deaths, 80,000 MCMC iterations in the space of a day. And if we're talking about an epidemic, what is real time? Real time is probably being able to analyse data in 4 to 6 hours, so we can get data from one day to inform what's happening in the next day. So a bit slower timescale than what Darren was talking about, but it is something where we can analyse data and react. So I've talked about sort of using MCMC methods. Obviously, what would be good is to develop this into sequential methods. And I've talked about the Markovian model, and there's actually possibilities of extending this work on beyond SAR to non-exponential infectious periods. Okay, and I'll finish there. Thank you for your attention.